have our second session this morning, and we'll be discussing end-of-life issues. Again, we'll have Rabbi Steinberg and Rabbi Brody addressing us. For the first topic, and it was already mentioned, this is the most important topic of the conference. I wouldn't say that, because I think they're all going to be important, and everyone will find their niche and their space. The reason that this may be for some very important is because there is an axiom in medical halacha which is the fundamental basis why the whole DNI issue comes up. So DNI, just the terminology, is do not intubate. So for decades, the axiom has been there is a concept of DNI, do not intubate, because the assumption has always been once you intubate, and we will discuss today that the issues are going to be withholding versus, as we've already been introduced, withholding versus withdrawing. But once you intubate, the assumption has always been that one may not wean or extubate, because that, of course, would be an active process, and that would be prohibited. I would like to ask Rabbi Steinberg, of course, to come and address this issue and shed some new light and some Torah and some halacha on this.
So, as Dr. Friedman said, one of the more complicated situations in halacha regarding end of life is what do you do with someone who is already on a respirator? As a preliminary note, it is permissible, according to most poskim, in certain circumstances, not to start a respirator, not to intubate someone and put him on a respirator. But once he is already on a respirator, is he stuck for a long time, or are there halachic ways to change the situation? Just to put things into perspective, this you already saw several times, right? So you are witnessing that everything is okay for the CME and you can get it freely and happily. Okay, so respiratory support or resuscitation, in principle, probably is already a Tanakhic occurrence. And there were two such instances, I assume everyone knows. One was Eliyahu and Ben Atzorfatit or Atzorfatit, depending on where it is written. And the story was that the son of the hostess of Eliyahu had choli chazak meod, asher lo notra bo neshama. He was so sick that he couldn't breathe. Was he dead or not, we'll see in a minute. And what did Eliyahu do? He came over the child for 3 times, davened, and apparently put in breathing into his nostrils, which is not stated specifically, and the child woke up. So the Ralbag says that indeed he made himself as if he is putting mouth to mouth and doing mouth to mouth resuscitation, but the Tosfot in Bava Metzia, and we'll see in a minute, asks, we know Eliyahu was Pinchas, and Pinchas was a Kohen. And if the child was dead, how was he allowed to be metame to the dead? So says the Tosfos, שהיה ברור לו שיחייהו, לכך היה מותר משום פיקוח נפש. He was so sure that he'll revive him that it was a situation of pikuach nefesh, and hence he was allowed, even though he was a Kohen, to be in touch with the dead. Because it seems like he actually touched and it was over him, which is halachically a ohel. And a kohen is metame be'ohel and metame b'maga umasa. So he did all 3 forbidden acts of tumas kohanim, but according to the Tosfos, that was a pikuach nefesh situation. The Rambam in Moira Nevuchim holds that he was very sick, but not necessarily was he dead. So this wasn't a situation of resuscitation in the sense that the Ralbag understood, in the sense that the Tosfos understood, that indeed he was dead and Eliyahu revived him. This was just a situation of a serious sickness, difficulty breathing, and therefore Eliyahu could resuscitate him, but not from death to life, but from a serious sickness to a better situation. This obviously takes away the kasha of the Tosfos because he wasn't dead. So a Kohen is allowed to treat a sick person. And the same says the Radak, that some say that he wasn't really dead, he was just very sick, and others say that he was really dead and it was a resuscitative measure. There's an interesting tshuva, a whole tshuva devoted it by the Radbaz, who says, שאלת ממני למאן דאמר פנחס אליהו, האח נטמע להחיות בן הצרפית. The same kasha that the Tosfos asks, and he brings a whole host of tshuvas, what happened there, was it a tumor, wasn't it a tumor, even going to the degree that this child wasn't a Jewish child. He was a goy, and a goy is only metame be'oil, but not b'maga u'masa. On the other side, he's metame b'maga u'masa, but not be'oil, and according to this explanation, he wasn't really above the child, but next to him, doing his procedures next to him, so he wasn't in an oil, and although it says alav in the Nesim that were walking in the desert, it says ve'alav mateh zeh, ve'alav mateh zeh, meaning not on top of him, but next to him. But there are many tshuvas, we won't go into it, this is a very specific, but I thought it's of interest when we're talking about resuscitation. And obviously the second case was Elisha and the son of the Shunamite, and here everyone agrees that he was dead. Elisha wasn't a Kohen, so all this shilas about Eliyahu did not apply, and he did the same procedure that he puts his mouse on top of his mouse and revived him. And there is a third hint that this was something known. This is Balaturim on the beginning of Shmos. The Torah says, Shema Achat Shifra v'Shema Sheni Pu'ah. Why was Miriam or Yocheved called Shifra? Shifra is from the term Shfoferet, because he says when a baby is born and sometimes he's not starting to breathe right after birth, so she would take a tube, put it in his mouth, and blow air into it, which is intubation. And instead of machine, it's the person who is doing a real respiratory resuscitation, and that's why she was called Shifra. So the concept that you can revive someone who is not breathing by breathing into his mouth and nostrils, that is a concept that is already from biblical times. Now, in order to understand the halacha in current days, obviously there is mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but that is not the issue. The issue is a resuscitation with a ventilator, with a respirator, with a machine, that needs some qualifications. So first of all, there are some distinctive concepts in halacha that actually were developed in the format that we now teach it, was by Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. He really made order with all the various types of treatments in end of life, how to define them, and what is permissible to withhold or to withdraw, and what is not. So the first distinction is between Chayei Sha'ah and Chayei Olam, and obviously everyone knows that Chayei Sha'ah doesn't mean 1 hour, and Chayei Olam doesn't mean immortality. Both are wrong. These are just terms. Chayei Sha'ah means temporary life, and Chayei Olam is what is beyond Chayei Sha'ah. But even Chayei Olam is Chayei Sha'ah. At some point, the person will die. How do you define Chayei Sha'ah and how do you define Chayei Olam is important, but at the moment I don't want to go into it. We discussed it in previous conferences, but I'll say it very briefly, that Chayei Sha'ah, according to most poskim, is defined as expected life less than 12 months, similar to the definition of treifa. Treifa is mentioned in Chazal that it is 12 months. Chayei is not mentioned at all. How long is Chayei? The Gemara distinguishes between Chayei and Chayei Olam, but doesn't define how long is Chayei. So the later poskim equated it to treifa, and Chayei is someone who can live 12 months. In the Israeli law, when we enacted the law on the dying patient, we reduced it to 6 months. We called a dying patient or a Chayei Sha'ah 6 months, because there are no statistics for 12 months. So even if we'll define that a person who will die within 12 months has a different set of rules than someone who will live longer because he's Chayei Sha'ah, we can't medically say that someone can live 12 months. If a physician tells a family, your parents or your child will live up to 12 months, it is the same as if we would say to 8 months or to 15 months or to 20 months. It's not based on anything. But 6 months, there are diseases that we know statistically that it makes sense. Now, there is a distinction between withholding and withdrawing. Halachically, it is kum v'aseh and shev ve'al ta'aseh. Shev ve'al ta'aseh is withholding. You just don't do anything and the person dies from his disease. Kum v'aseh, you do an act which hastens death. Now, halachically, it doesn't matter if the act that hastens death is what we call today active euthanasia, which is to inject a little dose of a medication that kills the person right away, or through a physician-assisted suicide, that the patient uses lethal medication, but he does it himself, not that the physician is doing it, but the physician prescribes it, or withdrawing something which at the act of withdrawal will kill the patient. All are one and the same. It is a kum v'aseh, it is an act of killing, and all are forbidden. As opposed to situations where I just don't interfere and the process of dying is continuing without my direct act. And that is distinguished between a continuous and an intermittent form of treatment. Again, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach made very clear order on that. And intermittent treatment means that the treatment per se has pauses which are part of the treatment. So for instance, dialysis, you invite a patient Sunday morning, you hook him up to the dialysis machine for 4 hours, let's say. You take him off the machine as part of the treatment. You're not hastening his death. That's how you treat him. And after 2 days, he comes back for another unit of treatment. Each unit of this kind is a separate unit, and therefore you can withhold the next unit. And if you come to think about it, almost all treatments in end-of-life situations are of this kind. Antibiotics, chemotherapy, radiotherapy, surgeries, everything is periodic. You do the act is finishing, and if you don't repeat it, then it's a shev ve'al ta'aseh. There are just very few treatments that are continuous. One of them is a respirator. Obviously, someone who is in need of a respirator, you can't invite him for 4 hours on Sunday and hook him up to the respirator, take him off, and call him on Tuesday to come back. He obviously will never come back because it is a continuous type of treatment. And the other example is a cardiac pacemaker that also works permanently. If you stop it, the patient will die because this is an act of stopping a continuous treatment. And the last distinctive feature is the distinction between treatments that are pertaining to life, whereas those who are pertaining to the disease. In other words, there are treatments that because the person is dying and has a lethal disease, you need to give him this treatment. So if he has cancer, you need to give him chemotherapy. If he has renal failure, you need to give him dialysis. But there are treatments that we give to the dying patient that are unrelated to the fact that he is dying, because a non-dying patient will need the same thing. So for instance, food and fluid and oxygen, every one of us needs it whether we are dying or not. So that is not pertaining to the dying situation, and that cannot be even withheld, as opposed to those treatments pertaining to the disease that can be withheld unless they are continuous, and then it is a withdrawal and it's not allowed. So these are briefly the concepts of treatment. So as I said, there is a cyclic treatment where there is a clear separation between cycles of treatment, and a continuous treatment, which by nature of treatment is continuous. Now, if we come to philosophy, and that is an introduction to what we are going to talk about, the ventilator, so there are actually two opposing values in such a situation. They may coincide and they may go together, but they may be contradictory. One is the value of life, which means, in principle, that every minute of life has a value. So if we take this value as an absolute value, and in philosophy, absolute means that there are no exceptions to the rule, because once you find an exception, it becomes relative to this exception. So there are no exceptions. And if we would define the value of life as of absolute value, then no matter what, continuous, not continuous, pertaining, not pertaining, you have to do everything possible to prolong every minute of life. There are no options. But most of the poskim and most of the philosophers do not view the value of life as of an absolute value. They view it as an extremely important value. But still there may be exceptions. And therefore, it is not an absolute value on the one hand, but it is very important, and therefore you can never hasten death, but there's no requirement to always prolong life. And hence, if the patient is suffering, or he doesn't want to be continuing life, or there's another reason why not to do it, you can weigh it as a reason to let the patient die. Now, from a halachic point of view, there are many sources to point to the fact that indeed life is not of an absolute value. The mere fact that wars are allowed by the Torah means that life is not an absolute value, because if I'm called as a soldier to go to a dangerous place, I'll get a zettel from my rabbi. My life is of absolute value. I can't go there because I'm endangering my life. And how can you conduct a war if everyone will say that his life is of absolute value? We have capital punishment and many other sources. And we have the story of Rabbi Yehuda Anossi, that the servant, the female servant, decided to let him die and to withhold further treatment, quote unquote, which was prayer. And indeed he died. And the halacha is like this servant. So you see that if life would have been of absolute value, we wouldn't listen to her. We would continue his prayer. And the same holds true for the value of autonomy. If I come as a patient and I say, I'm sick and tired of my life, I want you to kill me, that's my autonomous wish. Why don't you do it? If autonomy is the overriding principle, you should listen to me. And indeed, there are countries, like this country here in Canada, and others before, like the Netherlands, Belgium, certain parts of Australia. These are countries which take autonomy as an almost absolute value, and hence if a patient is dying and says, I don't want this life anymore, I want to die now, but he won't die from his disease now, he will die in 2 weeks or in a month, in order for him to die now, or in order for us to fulfill his autonomous wish, I have to shoot him. But in hospitals, usually we don't go with pistols, so we inject certain medication that kills him. So that is absolutely unacceptable halachically. Autonomy is important, but not absolute, and therefore we can override an autonomous wish if it is in contradiction with other values that we think are more important. Okay, so to sum up, we distinguish between Chayei Olam and Chayei Sha'ah. In Chayei Sha'ah, it is permissible to withhold. It is forbidden to withdraw if it hastens death. And it is permissible to remove a hindrance in a way that will be a withholding process, even though it is part of the treatment. Now, when we come to a respirator, if we are talking about, if the patient has a Chayei Olam, he has a chance to survive, he has a chance to recover, and he can live more than, let's say, 12 months. In this case, there are no options to take him off the respirator and let him die, because he is Chayei Olam. Chayei Olam, we don't discuss at all. We are discussing about a patient who has Chayei Shor. No matter what we'll do, even if he will stay on the respirator, he will die within 12 months or 6 months, depending on the definition. He is suffering, and he is unwilling to continue with the respirator. Let's take the scenario which is the clearest. He is still conscious or competent, and he motions to us he doesn't want anymore the respirator. ALA patients and others can be fully conscious and communicate, and he says, I don't want, I'm suffering, this is bothering me, I want to die. And you are keeping me on the respirator against my will, and you are continuing my suffering by continuing my life. So from a secular point of view, it is fully accepted all over, not only in Canada, that in this case, a physician is permitted to withdraw the respirator and let the patient die, because they don't distinguish between kum v'aseh and sheval taseh. For them, it's one and the same, as long as this is what the patient wants, and I'm not injecting a lethal drug, that is okay. But halachically, since a respirator is a continuous form of treatment, and if I'll withdraw it, that will be an act that will hasten death. This I am not allowed to do. Because, as we said, it's an act of discontinuing a continuous treatment. So, if we stop here, once a patient is on a respirator, he's stuck. Now, what are the situations that this can happen? It can happen when the patient willingly accepted to be put on a respirator. Let's say he underwent surgery, and for the surgery he was put on a respirator, and there were complications, and now if we would have asked him on this condition whether he wants to be intubated, he would say no. But he is already on a respirator willingly, because he was put on a respirator to begin with in accordance with his wishes. Another situation can be that indeed he didn't want to be on a respirator, but it was an emergency. Hatzole or Mada or whoever came to his house, saw that he's not breathing, automatically intubated him. They don't ask questions, because they don't have the time and the know-how to decide if yes or not to put him on a respirator. He's an unknown patient to them. What they see is either they do it right away or he dies, so they have no option. So they put him on a respirator, they bring him to the hospital, and it turns out that he has a living will saying, I don't want to be put on a respirator, but he is now already on a respirator. What do you do? Or someone who was put on a respirator legitimately, but its condition worsened. And if you would ask him now, he would say no, but now he's already on a respirator. So these are very tragic and complicated situations. What do you do in this case? So here are some of the options that are still ways halachically acceptable, some by all, some not by all, that we can stop the respirator under certain conditions. The best way is if legitimately we are weaning the patient from the respirator. Let's say he's now 20 days on the respirator, he's doing better, his pneumonia, his cancer, whatever, stabilized, and we are considering to weaning him from the respirator as a medical procedure, which we do all the time to people that we don't expect them to die, right? So we're weaning him off the respirator because we assess that if we'll take him off the respirator, he will be able to survive without the respirator. In this case, if it was done legitimately, and it's very tricky because many physicians that know this option say, yes, we think we can wean him, although they are sure that they can't. But I'm talking about purely halachically speaking, if it's an honest physician, we discuss with him, and he says, yes, he's stable, you can wean him. Weaning means gradually reducing the parameters of the respirator. The patient is still stable. We take him off the respirator. Now, 10 minutes later, he crashes. What do we do now? If we would discuss him now without knowing that he was on a respirator, in his situation now, we can withhold the respirator. But knowing that he was on a respirator and he was weaned and he crashed after 10 minutes, it means that either our assessment was wrong that we couldn't wean him, or we tried to wean him by all means, but it turned out not to be possible. So according to Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, in such a situation, if the patient holds out 24 hours without the respirator, even if after 24 hours there is again a worsening of his condition and now he requires a respirator, we allow not to put him back on the respirator. I asked him, why 24 hours? What about 12 hours? So he said, there are no sources to discuss the timing. It's just a matter of shikul hadas. His assessment is that he really stabilized when we weaned him after up to 24 hours. But he thought that 12 hours would also be acceptable. If he is stable and only after 12 hours he deteriorates, you don't have to put him on. Less than that, according to Shlomo Zalman, you have to put back the respirator. That is a matter of svora, as I said. There's no source to give these timings, but Shlomo Zalman is an authority. That is what he thought. Rabbi Osher Weiss disagrees, and he says any time that he was stable, it's sufficient to make a decision not to put him back. Now, anytime, I don't think that he means a minute or two, and again, it's a matter of assessment, but it's not clear from him if there's a minimum for the time. But I'm presenting to you what I heard from Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Another option is to turn the respirator from a continuous form of treatment to an intermittent form, to a cyclic form. And that is, for instance, in the old days, by the way, that happened all the time. When oxygen didn't come from the wall and was constantly available, respirators were connected to a tank of oxygen, and once the tank was exhausted, there was no oxygen, we switched the tank to a fuller tank, like we do with a barbecue and a gas balloon. The gas finishes, we replace it with a new gas. So in those days, everyone agreed that if the oxygen in the tank was finished, you don't need to replace it if there is an indication not to put him on now. If he wouldn't be on the respirator, and now you wouldn't put him on a respirator, but he is on a respirator and the tank is finished, then you don't have to replace it. It's a withholding process that you're not doing an act to continue. But nowadays, everything comes from the wall, so there's no minute that there's no oxygen in the machine. So one way is to take the machine off the oxygen from the wall, attach it to a tank, like we do, for instance, if we move the patient to X-ray or to a certain treatment, we don't schlep the wall with him in order to get the oxygen with him to the X-ray machine. So we put him on a tank. So we leave him on a tank. And if the tank is finished, we are not obligated to replace it. Another option, which I'll speak separately, is to adjust a timer a priori to the respirator, and I'll explain in a minute. A fourth option, again, that was Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's position, is that if the patient is indeed dying and suffering, and if he wouldn't be on a respirator, we wouldn't put him on a respirator, would be allowed to withhold the respirator, is now that he is on a respirator, to reduce the parameters of the respirator to a level that he is still stable at the moment, knowing very well that with time there will be complications and he'll need higher parameters, but there is no obligation to raise the parameters, and then he will die on the respirator. We didn't remove the respirator, and yet he dies. There was an interesting story. Once, it was a known story. So I can mention names. It was President Navon, who was one of the presidents of Israel. His wife was very sick. She had metastatic breast cancer. She suffered terribly. In those days, palliative medicine wasn't so advanced. She was in an intensive care unit at Hadassah on a respirator, and she continued to live because she got the best treatment. The wife of the president obviously gets best treatment. The president turned to the doctors and he said, I don't want my wife to suffer anymore, but I don't want to do anything against halacha. Find me a solution. They didn't know what to tell him. If it's not against halacha, she has to be on a respirator. If she has to be on a respirator, she continues to suffer. There's no way out. They asked me if I have any idea, and I said, I don't know. So I went to Shlomo Zalman, I told him this story, and he said, how much oxygen are you breathing right now? So let's say in Yerushalayim maybe 19%, maybe 20%, 21%. He said, why does she need 100%? Reduce it to 20%. And the same with all the parameters, with the PEEP and everything. She doesn't need a maximum treatment. She's going to die. She needs to be on a respirator. We can't remove, but we can reduce the parameters. And they reduced the parameters, and within 24 hours, she died. So I came to Shlomo Zalman and I said, that's a tremendous chiddush, very important to so many people who are on respirators, suffering, and no one knows how to handle it, how to finish it. May I publish in your name that this is an option? So he said no. Why? Because he said, this is my chiddush. I don't know if any of the Gedolim would agree with me. I am firm with my opinion. Next time you have such a patient and you'll come to ask me, I'll tell you to do the same. But for publishing, I don't want to be the only one that does it. So I said, what will take that you would agree? I insisted because I thought it's a very important tool. So he said, if any of the other Gdolim will agree, I'll consider. So I knew that if I'll go to Avel Yashiv, the answer would be no. Avel Yashiv, everything new is no. So there was no point to go to him. So I went to Rav Wozner, who was certainly one of the greatest poskim, and I told him what happened and what Shlomo Zalman paskent. So he said, I agree with Shlomo Zalman except for one point. And the point is that if you reduce the parameters, you have to do it gradually. Because if you reduce it at once, this by itself may hasten death. So if she is getting 100%, try 80%, wait, see what happens. If she is stable, go down to 60, and so on. And once she's unstable, stay at that level. So I went back to Shlomo Zalman, and I told him that I went to Rav Wosner, and he was very interested to know what he said. I said what he said, that he agrees with you except for this. So he said, you see, I was right that I didn't let you publish, because he's right. If you would have published the way I told you, that would be wrong. I didn't think about it, and he's right. So I said, okay, so now can I publish it? He said, absolutely, publish in his name. But finally, he agreed to be published. I published it in both names. And actually, we are using it at Shaarei Tzedek, not very frequently, but in special occasions, we are using this method. Now, there are two debatable options which we don't use. One is that, by definition, a respirator has to be stopped occasionally for suctioning, because there is accumulation of mucus and you have to suction. So if you stop it for suctioning, maybe you don't have to reconnect it at the time. But that wasn't acceptable by Shlomo Zalman, because he said that is not like a dialysis machine that you really stop for a day, for 2 days. It's clear that you stop. Here, it's part of the treatment. It's not really stopping the respirator, it's part of the treatment. And the other one that Rav Zalman Nehemiah Goldberg, the son-in-law of Shlomo Zalman, agreed, but many disagreed with him, and that is in special occasions when there is a shortage of respirators, like it was in the COVID period. So let's say someone is on a respirator because we thought that it will save him, but he is deteriorating, he's going to die anyway, even though he's on a respirator, and now comes a new patient that needs a respirator and has greater chances to survive if he gets the respirator, but we have no machines. So instead of the two dying, one is on a respirator dying, and one is dying because he doesn't have a respirator, said of Zalman Nehemiah, you can remove the respirator from the one who doesn't have chances anymore in order to save someone who will have chances. So that is not in order to hasten his death just because we don't want him to live. It is in order of pikuach nefesh to save someone else. But most poskim disagreed, because the act of killing of this patient is still forbidden even if it's done for a pikuach nefesh of someone else. So that's debatable. So now let me just describe to you the issue with the timer. The concept of the timer was introduced in a committee that I chaired to legislate the Dying Patient Act in Israel. And everyone obviously was very worried that by law in Israel it will follow the halacha that you can't stop a respirator, which is different than any other country in the world. What will we do with so many patients who are stuck on the machines and they don't want it, but we can't stop it? So the idea came up to put a timer on the ventilator, meaning before you hook up the patient to the ventilator, you put a timer on the ventilator. Let's say you set it up for 5 days. And if within 5 days the patient is doing better, so you stop the timer and it will continue. If the patient is doing worse, or there's no point to continue, then the timer will automatically stop the respirator. Won't be a man act, won't be a withdrawal. It will be part of how the machine works. The machine, lechatchila, works this way. And Vardit Ravitsky, who was a member of our committee, published it in the BMJ. We got mixed, as obviously everything new, you get mixed comments. Some were very happy with it, some thought it's just a trick, and there were all kinds of remarks. But what is the concept? So the timer enables doctors to honor the wishes of patients and families without termination of continuous treatment of a dying patient, which may cause death. In other words, this is not a direct act that hastens death. That is an indirect act, which is a built-in situation in the machine, similar to the oxygen tank, which is finishing, and you don't replace it. So the timer is finishing the acts of the machine, and you don't replace it. Same concept. And therefore, we thought this would be permissible. So it is like a Shabbos clock in principle. What do we do? I assume everyone, or at least most of us, every Friday, we set up the clock for the lights on Shabbos, and then on Shabbos, there are acts which we are not allowed to do. We can't put on or put off the light on Shabbos, but we instigated that it will go on and off by putting a timer when it was allowed to do it, on Friday, right? So a priori, we set the timer, and then the melocha, the thing that is forbidden to be done, is done automatically, and that is accepted almost by everyone. The only one who didn't accept it was Moshe Feinstein, and he said that if he would have lived at the time where such a Shabbos clock was introduced, he would have answered it. But since it's so frequently encountered that everyone agrees, he doesn't want to say anything. But most poskim really accept it as something that is lechatchila mutar. So that is the same concept with the timer. You put it at a time where it doesn't do anything wrong, when you just intubate the patient. And once it's going into action, it's done automatically, you didn't do anything, and the respirator stopped. And that concept was accepted by several poskim. Not all agree, like any new thing, you'll never find something that everyone agrees, but at least some of the leading poskim agreed. So the first one to agree to it was Rabbi Waldenberg, and that was many years before our time of ventilators and timers. And he really was talking about a real Shabbos clock. You take a regular, in the old days, a Shabbos clock was a clock that was a string attached to the switch, and when it rang, it pushed the swing and it closed the light. That is how it used to be, not like nowadays that everything is electrically controlled. So the Director General of Shaare Tzedek Hospital, Professor David Meir, just anecdotally, he was a pathologist in Einstein. And when the previous director of Shaare Tzedek passed away, he was elected to become the Director General of the hospital. Waldenberg was the in-house poisek of Shaare Tzedek. He lived across the street, and there was a very good contact with him all the time. And he wasn't consulted about this appointment. And he got very angry. How come you appoint a pathologist to a Frum hospital? A pathologist does daily forbidden acts. He is dissecting bodies, which is not allowed. And he will become the director of the hospital, which I, Rabbi Waldenberg, are in charge of the halachas there. So he got very angry, and he stopped coming to the hospital. But with time, he realized that he was a very erlich Yid. He didn't do really autopsies. He just did pathological specimens. He was okay. And he was very close to him. And with time, they became friends. And David Mayer sent him this question. And he told him, you know, there's a problem with people on a respirator. How do we get rid of it? And I, David Mayer, suggest to put a Shabbos clock on the respirator. And he answered at length that that's okay. You can do it. There's an intrinsic contradiction between his positions. I won't go into it. I asked him. I never got an answer. But he felt that that would be okay. The same is Moshe Sternbuch, who is still with us. He is the Gaivet of the Eida Haredit. A big, big poisek, has thousands of tshuvas called Tshuvot Vanagot. And in one of them, he writes that he heard about such a concept of a timer on a respirator, and he thinks it's okay. So that was his psak. And a shaila that I wrote to Rabbi Zilberstein. Rabbi Zilberstein is the son-in-law of Rabbi Yashiv, and he is a major poisek in Bnei Brak, especially on medical halachic issues. And I asked him about a newborn baby after a preemie, 25th week of pregnancy, underwent full resuscitation. Can we attach a timer on his respirator, because such a preemie, his chances to survive are slim, and then even if he survives, there are many, many problems with him. Would it be permissible? And he answered, can't see it, but anyway, he answered it's okay to do it. And the next one was Rabbi Neuwirth, the author of Shmirat Shabbat K'ilchata. Dr. Halperin asked him about this situation, and he also allowed to put the timer on a respirator. So we have at least several major poskim who thought that this would be an appropriate way. Okay, now, just to finish up, there is no such timer. It doesn't exist. And the reason that it doesn't exist is that we did a prototype on a respirator with a dial, connecting the respirator to a dial that is breathing, putting the respirator, and it worked very well. Meaning that it stopped when we wanted it to stop, and more importantly, it didn't stop at the time that it didn't want to, because that would be killing the patient before the time, and maybe he has chances to survive. So the timer has to be very accurate. Now, what's the problem? To put a Shabbos clock on such a respirator won't work, because the respirators are built in a system that when there is a shortage of electricity, it kicks in. Because imagine a regular timer, and something happens, there's no electricity, all the patients will die. So the respirator is independent. You can't stop it just because you circumvent the circuit. So if you put a regular Shabbos clock, and it will pull the plug, pull the switch, it will automatically restart. So you need something that is more sophisticated, that can circumvent the process of the ventilator to save itself. So that's a more complicated machinery. Secondly, we don't want it, let's say we put the timer for 5 days. We don't want that in 5 days it will stop. Maybe something happened, maybe there's still something to do, maybe there should be a chance for it. So the idea was 12 hours before the time set, it will ring, it won't stop, we'll reassess the situation of the patient, of his wishes, and so on. And only if we are sure that we can go on, then we'll restart the timer, and then it will go into effect. So it's complicated. So this worked well on a dial. But it's a new device. a new device needs an IRB approval, right? You need to do testings. You need to make sure that it's all okay. Now, in order to test it on a patient, you need his informed consent. It's a regular experiment. It's a medical experiment that you need informed consent. Most, if not all, intubated patients in an ICU can't give consent. They are unconscious, they can't talk, they don't understand. How can you get the informed consent? So we broke our head for a long time, and finally there were incidentally 2 patients that were awake, alert, intubated, and we could talk to them. And they agreed. So we did an experiment on these 2, and on both something was wrong. Not to the degree that it killed them, but something was wrong. So the IRB said, you have to fix it. So we went back, we fixed it. But now we couldn't find anyone that can consent on the new machine. So at the moment, we don't have a machine because we can't get a consent. The other, and I'll finish by that, the other incident happened during COVID. As you know, at the beginning of COVID, no one was prepared, and there were many, many patients who needed an ICU bed and respirators. And in Israel, there was a fear that there won't be enough respirators for so many patients. So they bought, 2,000 machines from all over the world, which are still lying somewhere wasted because they bought quickly, not checking, just to have it. And 2 companies in Israel started to produce respirators. So I told the Minister of Health at the time, that is an opportunity that the company will build in, not an outside timer. Part of the technology of the respirator will be a timer. Because in Israel, we are interested. A company that does respirators in the United States doesn't care for it, because in the United States, you can pull the plug. So what do they need a timer? But here, it should work. So we looked into this option, and it turned out, I don't know why, I don't understand in it, but it was very expensive to add this technological device. And because it was so expensive, and there were many expenses with the COVID pandemic, that the Ministry of Health didn't like the idea, and to this day, we don't have it. But if we'll have it, I think that could be a good solution. Thank you.
Do the same rules apply for a family member to make the consents or what?
Well,
You kind of skirted that.
It could be, but the IRB wasn't happy. They said this is a very new...
Not just for that technology, but for everything.
No, for other things, obviously, it's not really a consent by family. It is an agreement or discussion, because they can't replace the patient. When does a family replace? If you need to do something to save the patient, and you can't do it because you don't have the consent, the patient can't cooperate. Then there are various levels on how to decide what to do. And family can be one of these, but not when you do an experiment. It's not for the treatment.
Yeah. No, I understand. No, but as well as doing something to save a patient, but doing one of the things you talked about.
Sure.
It works with the same rules apply.
But family is a problematic method, because who is the family? Is it the wife? Is it the son? Is it the brother?
What's the
and
hierarchy?
what if they disagree with each other? And who decides? So you can talk about an appointed surrogate, appointed by court. Who says that he really knows what the patient would want? A lot of ethical questions in that.
Yeah,
but not in an experiment. In an experiment, you don't do it.
No, we have an established hierarchy as to
Right.
who is
Right.
the...
Maybe you'll talk about the hierarchy in a living will.
2 questions. One is about decreasing the parameters on the ventilator. And I just want to make sure I heard correctly. So sometimes we can decrease the parameters and the patient's stable for 5 minutes or 5 hours, but sometimes we decrease it right away. You see the O2 sat is dropping, let's say. And what I thought you said was that to hold it at that level, or do we have to return it to previous level?
No, you reduce it to a level that the patient is still stable.
Right.
Once he's stable, you leave it at that level, and if later he becomes unstable, you don't have to increase it back to what it was.
Right, but stable could be measured just vital signs, or we could decrease.
Yeah,
or
just
it could be a
vital
blood gas an hour later.
No, in dying patients, usually we don't take blood gases and this. It's useless. What for? You want them,
Right,
you
that's
want
what
them
I
to
said.
die. You don't want to correct everything.
So just to be concrete about it, patients on 100% O2 on the ventilator, and we decrease them to 90% or 85%, and suddenly it stops dropping. We have to put them back up again?
If it's within 12 hours, yes. If 12 hours he was stable, everything was okay, then if now he deteriorates, you don't have to.
So the 12-hour rule would apply for the ventilator changes also, not just
Right,
extubation?
exactly.
Okay, the other question was about the suctioning, whether that's considered cyclic, whether one could just skip suctioning. In
Could
other words,
one-
patients need suctioning
Right.
because it impedes airflow, etc. Wouldn't that be like a cyclic type of treatment that one could skip the suctioning, let the patient die?
No, so because this is the form of treatment, it's like stopping the oxygen for 50 minutes and then let the patient suffocate. That is not allowed because this is almost as an act of killing. You are drowning him in his saliva. That
Got it,
most
okay.
poskim say this is part of the treatment and you have to continue it. But while you do it, he is not connected. Would that be a cyclic type of the treatment? That was the question.
And if let's say I decreased the parameters, I went off shift, is the next physician obligated, it's only 2 hours to turn everything back up again? Or
No, it doesn't matter about the shift. It matters on the timing. In Israel now, according to the law, there is one physician who is responsible for one patient. And all the decisions, day and night, Sunday or Monday, have to go through it. It's not everyone that comes on board makes a new calculation and a new discussion and a new decision. That is done today in Israel by one person from the beginning to the end.
And if I knew someone in the United States was going to take me over and would be willing to leave the patient.
Even longer. I mean, if he follows the Shlomo Zalman rules, then he should do the way as if you are still there, as it was decided.
A number of the cases you presented, the Halachic opinions were very specific. You know, so you went to the top guy, he gave you the Halachic decision. And the problem I see could be, where are these people? These decisions happen all the time. Somebody's in the ICU and is unstable or stable now and they're not going to be stable, something's going to happen. You know, they happen all the time. Are the poskim in the hospital to make decisions? You know, these come up all the time and people have to make decisions. And it seems to me that a lot of decisions that you say, well, this guy says this and this guy says that, you're left in, it could be, you know, make up an opinion. You know, I'm going to follow this opinion. It depends on what my training is. There's nothing specific. So I wonder if you could address
No,
that.
I mean, that's how halacha, and by the way, medicine works. If you are on call and you spoke to your attending and he told you one thing, if would be a different attending, he would tell you a different thing. And now that he told you he's not there anymore and something happens, what do? It's a matter of understanding the principles and acting accordingly. What I try to show you is what principles have been accepted by some of the poskim. It's not to say that everyone would agree. Maybe you'll ask a different posek, he'll tell you he doesn't agree to it. I don't know, I'm saying. But I'm presenting to you principles. And you have to act daily according to the principles, like you do in medicine. You learned once how to treat streptococcal pneumonia, and you don't ask every day if the streptococcus is of this kind or that kind. What do? You do what you learned and you know how to do. But you need to know the parameters of what you can do. And that's what I try to point out.
I was curious about, you went to Posek, two things. One gave an opinion that 24 hours of stability is okay, and then you said, what about 12? You said 12. And the other case was, let's cut from 100 to 20, and somebody else said 180. What I'm curious is, I understand that Posek would have the final word, but aren't these really medical judgments? Like how does a Posek know you only need 12 or 24 hours to determine whether a patient is stable? Like, this is
No, do you know medically which is better, 12 or 24 hours? Is it a medical question?
I think, like, if this happened in my family and we didn't go to the Posek, I would know better than my family members that weren't
No,
physicians.
on this question.
On either of
Is
these questions.
stability of 12 hours more a sign that it was stable than 24 hours, medically speaking? It's not a medical question.
I'm wondering why you went from 24 to 12. I think that's because you thought that was enough for stability
Yeah,
based on your medical
but
expertise.
not because, no, I don't know
Based
any
on
medical
experience,
fact.
medical experience.
You know any medical fact that can answer this question?
It's
It's a matter of judgment of what is called stable. The stability is judged by the physician, not by the rabbi.
Right.
Whether he is stable in this 12 hours or 24 hours is the judgment of the physician because it's a medical question. But whether it's sufficient, 12, 15, 20, 24 hours, it's a matter of judgment. And you can accept, Rabbi Auerbach himself said that it's his judgment. It's not because there's a Gemara that says that this is what's called stable.
I'm
In
curious.
all these matters,
Yeah.
there is an issue of shikul hadat. There's nothing specifically written neither in medicine nor in halacha. It is a matter of shikul hadat. But what I'm trying to point to you is not the 12 or 24 hours, but the principle that reducing parameters is not equivalent to withdrawing the respirator.
Sure.
That is a principle.
Sure.
But the details, you can argue. I mean,
Sounds
it's
like
such a...
Abraham and Stone.
But in medicine it's the same. Ask this expert, he'll tell you so, and ask another expert, he'll the opposite.
Why did you ask to go from 24 to 12? Why did
No,
you
I asked him why 24, and since he said that it's not something that is specific, I tried maybe less.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Steinberg. There will be plenty of time. We're in a small group over Shabbos. You'll have time to ask some of the more technical questions that pertain to each of the cases you have. I want to move on. The next topic that we're going to be discussing is the halachic living will. So going back, this is not the topic that we're going to discuss, is the new approach. There has already been a halachic living will from the RCA. Being that this is a Canadian conference, I just want to point out that the Vada Rabbanim of Toronto put out a living will, which really is quite different than the one from the RCA. I'm stealing his thunder. I am sorry. Maybe I'll leave that then. Anyways, I didn't see your slides. So without further ado, Rabbi Brody.
Okay. This is the first time it's being publicly discussed. It was designed by myself and my colleague, Rabbi Dr. Jason Weiner, as the senior chaplain of Cedar Sinai Medical Center. And it is not to be used in Canada yet. So I just want to put that out there. The version you're seeing, think about it. But the second part, you'll see. The second part can be used anywhere in the world. We're going to be focusing on Chutz La'aretz and not in Israel, because Israel's different laws regulating this. And the reason why it's not usable yet in Canada is my Canadian legal advisors are still working out a little bit of the formulations, which are sensitive to Ontario law and Quebec law and this or that. Also, if you come from the great states of Ohio, New Hampshire, Wisconsin, and Texas, we still fiddling around with there because federalism has its downsides. But nonetheless, I want to show you the approach and give you a little bit of background of what we're trying to do. So this whole concept of a living will, right, is a matter or was a matter of dispute in rabbinic circles. And I want to show you a very fascinating debate between two of the major powerhouses of Jewish medical ethics in the 20th and beyond centuries, Rabbi Lord Emanuel Jacobovitz Zitzal and Rabbi Tendler Zitzal. And Rabbi Jacobovitz, he publishes in his book called Dear Chief Rabbi of Correspondence. He was very against this whole notion of saying that we're going to have a living will. What's a living will? So just as you leave a last will and testament about where your financial affairs should go, so too, while you are alive, you would create something which would talk about your will of what treatment should be due as you age or get sick and whatnot, including specific directives. And certainly in the trend was in the 80s, of very specific directives. If I'm in X, Y, and Z situation, do X or don't do Y. And Rabbi Jacobovitz took an approach which says this whole notion of a living will is alien to Jewish thought and law, because the will of a Jew is to live. So the notion of saying that a living will, that we can have an option of choosing, relating to some of the questions of autonomy that Rabbi Steinberg was referencing to, Lord Jacobovitz was against this concept. And he was against it as a matter of principle, but he's also against it as a matter of the culture in which we live in. He was very much afraid that the wave of autonomy was going to take us in bad directions, and the will of a Jew should be to live. And so this whole notion of saying, I want X, Y, and Z, or I want you to make this decision for me, is inappropriate, because there's always one correct decision. Now, in contrast to that, you had Rabbi Tendler, and this is a debate that they have going on, right? Which Rabbi Tendler said that this concept will be halachically acceptable, but there has to be two conditions. A, procedures that can be withheld or withdrawn do not include hydration and nutrition. Now, it's relating to the questions that Professor Steinberg was mentioning beforehand. He was very much without, now, you'll see some of the things he specifies. It's not exactly the same list as of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, which is a side conversation. But his point was saying that the options have to be limited to things within the realm of halacha. But if the options are limited to things that are permissible within halacha, this is an acceptable idea. And the second thing was that you find the requirement for the input of your attending a physician. In a regular living will, you also should be doing this with regard to bringing in the posek as well for checks and balances. And in many ways, Rabbi Tendler's view on this won the day, but we'll see in what ways and how. And so Rabbi Tendler was the head of the Halachic Committee of the Rabbinical Council of America. And in 1991, the RCA put out what's a healthcare proxy and directive. Now let's make sure we understand the terms here, because it's important. You have a proxy, which is a form that appoints an agent. Now there might be defaults of who you would ask if you don't have a proxy, but part of the point of a proxy is for someone to say, I want this person to make the decisions in case when I am not available or not able to make decisions for myself. And there's a little bit of a discussion about this, but let's assume for our purposes that they'll make the decisions and what they think I would want in these cases, what's known as substituted judgment. Okay? Then you have a notion of advanced healthcare directive, which is not just appointing a proxy or durable power of attorney for healthcare purposes, but is also saying specific things. What I want X, Y, and Z done. I'm directing that to be done. And so Rabbi Tendler crafts this element here, which is an element of a healthcare proxy, and says, I hereby appoint this person to be my agent. Note, he gives an option as well to consult with halachic authority. And putting in this, of course, is once I bring in the healthcare authority, my agent is no longer able to make decisions about artificial nutrition and hydration. Well, who is? Answer, the rabbi. And then he goes on to say, I have an alternate. And then you get into a detailed directive. This is pretty wild. We have 4 different situations. If I can't read the print here, but I'll read it, some of it. If I am in a coma or a persistent vegetative state, and in the opinion of my physician and several consultants, have no known hope of regaining awareness or higher mental functioning, no matter what is done, then my wishes regarding use of the following, if considered medically responsible, would be. And you see a list on the left, and you check, I want and I don't want. This is very, very detailed. The obvious problem with this, of course, is does anyone filling out this document know what this is talking about? But this wasn't just a trend in the RCA document. This was a trend in many medical circles in general. We gave very specific scenarios, and we gave very specific treatments. You decide, do I want X, Y, or Z? Additionally, in this document of the RCA, there's a couple of issues here. Well, if there's a disagreement between what I just wrote on page 2 and my proxy, who do I want to win? And Rabbi Tendler put in, I also have the option of saying, yes, not just option, but sort of the default, I will donate organs. So you understand this is a loaded document on many different levels because Rabbi Tendler, of course, position was that respiratory brain death is a halachic criterion for death, and therefore you can donate organs, and he pushed this through into the RCA proxy. When that happened at that time, at about the same time, the Aguda, the other major rabbinic group in the United States, put out their own proxy, and it's very interesting why. They made a number of declarations explaining why this would be, but they said that the likelihood is too great in such a situation that medical procedures will be performed or withheld in ways that constitute a violation of halacha. You're going to find yourself in the hospital, in the ER, the ICU, whatever it might be. We need to have an advanced statement that's prepared for your healthcare providers to understand what you'd want or wouldn't want. And of course, what we want is not specific matters at this stage, but follow halacha. And so the Aguda, at about the same time that the RCA puts out theirs, puts out 2 parts. One is a proxy. You appoint your competent adult to make the decisions. And the second is the directive. But the directive is, I want all decisions to be a shaila. And I want it to be, right, something where I designate a specific rabbi. Now, interestingly enough, in the original forms, they make clear they're not going to specify what it is that should or shouldn't be done, because that's difficult to know in difficult circumstances, and there are different shitot in the poskim. You are going to decide this with who your posek is, and those decisions are going to be made in consultation with your mora hara. So it's actually very interesting. In the original version of the Aguda Living Will, it's much more of a proxy, focused on appointing a proxy, and to have a general directive for people to understand you want to follow halacha. What's fascinating is the RCA proxy document basically fell by the wayside. And it fell by the wayside for a number of different reasons. Reason number one is the whole trend became to understand that that menu of options of I want or don't want isn't really practical. It's not practical so that people filling it out don't know what these terms mean. It's also not practical because you're running marathons and you're 55 and you're signing that document, and when you're 82 and the issues come up, your opinion may have changed along the way. Right? So how good is it to predict and say, I want X, Y, and Z, when you don't even know what X, Y, and Z mean, and of course your position might change. And the second issue is that the RCA document assumed that halacha permits organ donation, and since that became a big labor dick discussion within RCA circles, that also made a problem, and therefore the RCA more or less moved in 2009 to the Aguda model. What's interesting is that the Aguda itself started to change their provision. Why? The Aguda, we said beforehand, initially had left it as very general. I want a shaila, but as healthcare trends changed, remember the famous cases of healthcare in the United States in particular, but other places as well, is where the doctors were insisting on continuing treatment and the family of the patient was saying, right, withdraw or stop. That was the initial fights. Then the trend, of course, has flipped, right? So where you have cases where the hospitals have no problem of stopping treatment in one form or another, and the family wants something to be done. And so the Aguda said, we need to create a document which starts to make it very clear, right, that without an 11 way, the general default is, if I suffer cardiac or respiratory arrest, we'll see a couple of examples of this momentarily. I'll go back, sorry, right? Then we want these things to be done, unless my rabbi or agent says otherwise. Okay, so if you take a look at the formulation here, It's actually interesting. In the Aguda text as follows. I direct my agent to consult with the following Orthodox rabbi, and I ask my agent to follow his guidance. Any lawyers in the room? Even if you're not a lawyer, let's think this through. Think in a lawyerly cup right now. Who's the agent? Is it your agent, or is it your rabbi? Meaning, if you're telling your shaliach to tell the shaliach, right, who's the shaliach? So who's the agent here? There are cases in New Jersey where the hospitals insisted that the rabbi come down and sign the paper as well, because they said, we don't know what this document is doing in terms of who it's appointing. But the other question that comes is, take a look at a recent edition. I understand totally where this is coming from, but think about this formulation. This is in the living will that is used today. I am aware that there may come a time when I'm asked to reconsider, sorry, let's start from the beginning. I'm making a request to medical providers. I have made a decision set forth in this document, particularly those stating that I want my healthcare decisions made by a healthcare agent, in accordance with Orthodox Jewish law and consultation with an Orthodox rabbi, after a great deal of thought, and in view of my very deeply held religious beliefs. I am aware that there may come a time when I'm asked to reconsider these decisions. In other words, the document is anticipating. The hospital is going to say, you really want this to be done to you? Do you really want resuscitation here? And I'm telling you now, don't ask me that in a way that's going to try to persuade me to vary from the position I've said here. And if you're going to ask me about it, only do it when my proxy and hopefully also my rabbi are around. What's that Gouda trying to do? To preempt the conversation. We really, really, really do not want any life-sustaining treatments to be stopped in any way unless we initiate it and unless the proxy or the posek or Orthodox Jewish law allows it. So this is the existing document, and I'm not being critical by this in any means. What I mean is they understand they have a certain vision of what it means to deal with hospitals today. And the vision is that the hospitals are going to try to stop treatment, and the default in halacha is to always keep treatment going, and therefore you create a legal text which tries to buttress that position from the get-go. So when you show up in the hospital, what do you have? A directive which already says, I have a proxy, I have a posek, I have halacha, this is what should be done. Now, if you look at the Ontario model, which we were talking about, the ladies were talking about earlier, which is being disseminated, I guess, during COVID in particular, so here it even gets a little bit, relates a little bit more to what we talked about last night as well, where it says, listen, I'm Jewish and I have rights under the Canadian law and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And I decide with these rights that my health care should be done according to strict Orthodox Jewish interpretation, and tradition should any uncertainty arise as to my wishes. I fully subscribe to the values and beliefs of Judaism, that every moment of life is of infinite value. I therefore direct that unless determined by a rabbinic advisor, my life be prolonged for as long as possible by any means medically available. And then it goes on to say, I wish to always receive all possible life-sustaining health care to sustain my life for as long as possible. And this I direct, right? For further clarity, you asked, but this includes anything serious, life expectancy, unless my rabbinic advisor says otherwise. Okay, so this is an approach. We've moved away from the RCA approach, the original 1991 approach, which says detail things in great level, make those decisions, which I totally agree with, which is the trend in the medical world as well. But part of what the Aguda model, the Chaim Aruchim, which is part of the Aguda model right now, is to try to promote a vision which says that we have to go in on the assumption that there's going to be some form of combative discourse, if you will, between the hospital and the Orthodox Jewish patient. And we want to make very clear that either the proxy or the rabbi is going to make the decisions here and let people know that we want everything to be done unless told otherwise. Now, this is a totally fine model if you agree that every moment of life is of infinite value, which is Jewish value. And if you agree, right, that your decisions should be either made by your proxy or your posek or this general thing, right? The question is this work? One second. The question is, does it work on a couple of different levels? On the legal level, it's an interesting question, which has to be tested, right, in court. Is this an actual clear proxy directive? Because I've spoken now to, again, I'm not being critical of it, because everyone's trying to experiment here. I've spoken to 4 lawyers in 4 different countries, Western countries around the world, who say to me, this is not a clear proxy designation. Who's the proxy here? Is it the family member, or whoever else you decide to be? Is it the rabbi, which again, I understand why they want to do that. Or is it that you just want to follow halacha, whatever that might be? Now, in this model at least, they tell you what halacha means. I value every moment of life as of infinite value, and keep me going in any way possible unless you say X, Y, and Z. So that's a model, and it's certainly a legitimate model, and people can use it. Now, when we started to think about Embatai, well, can we create a different model that will be usable? So we started to ask, on the one hand, we very much don't want to go back to this. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense anymore. No one's doing that today. Meaning, I should say no one, but the general trend today is that this doesn't make a lot of sense, because there have been many studies in the medical world, right, who have shown that these advanced directives don't help too much. People's minds change, scenarios come up, people don't understand what this means, and therefore this is being shelved in a lot of different ways. Not always, right? There are definitely people who promote, there's the 5 Wishes Project, there are different types of programs. You can find these documents online. The Conversation Project, the 5 Wishes, which will sometimes have an advanced directive like this, but at least about some issues, but not as much. The second question which we were concerned with is, on the one hand, we really want our health care to be done by halacha. On the other hand, what exactly does that mean? Halacha is worked on a case-by-case basis. We have different patients in front of us, different scenarios, the different wishes can be, right? Some of the things we were just talking about. So how can you write a directive like this if in practice it's a lot more nuanced? The other problem is that when people raised us and the doctors, we talked about this formulation, the doctor said to us, what you're setting up here is for a confrontation model. You're assuming that they're going to want to kill you, and we want to keep alive, and how you're going to walk in the hospital, and that's how the whole discourse is going to begin. That's not a very healthy way to start a dialogue. And so what we've been working on for the last sort of year is something in which we try to help people figure out the netivot. We don't know what pathways we're going to go in life. Let's set you up in a way that will help you prepare for the different types of contingencies that we cannot predict. Because no one knows where the health journey is going to take them on. But we want to have in place something which helps protect you in the following sense. A, on a legal level, that clarifies who should make these decisions. And B, that helps facilitate an informed decision-making within your family. So let's take a look, if we can, at the document that's in front of you. Now, there are 2 different parts to this. Okay? Obviously, there's some instructions here, but I'm explaining to the outside. The first part, which you'll see here on what's known as page 4 here, is very simple. Oh, by the way, I happen to think that aesthetically, this looks a lot better than this. Right? So obviously we work with the graphic designer. We work with the graphic designer in order to do this properly, and in color schemes. We're also the only Jewish organization that seems not to use the color blue, which I'm very proud of. But in any case, although I love the color blue, but in any case, we try to make this super simple, following the models that we see in general society. You put your personal information, you choose your proxy and alternates. Why do you need an alternate? Sometimes your proxy isn't available. Sometimes the proxy is in Peru. Sometimes all sorts of things. And you have 3 different options. Should you put down your spouse? Well, if you're 50, maybe you should put down your spouse. That's number 1. If you're, 80, maybe not. Right? You have to depend on that. You got to think that through. It's a careful choice you have to make. Who do you want to be the proxy? And I have all sorts of fascinating conversations with people when they ask me, which of my kids should I appoint? Right? I don't know. So some, like the lawyers, can draw up for you if you have 4 kids. So the first 2 years, who's going to make the decision? So they wanted to make it to be, well, it'll be a vote. But it's only 4 kids. How do you decide to vote? So if in the next 2 years something happens, the oldest kid has the deciding vote. And if it happens from 3 to 4 years, number 2. This doesn't make any sense. Right? You got to decide within the family, and you have to have open conversations with your family. I want this person to make these decisions, not the other one. That's an interesting family dynamic. Sometimes, but at the end of the day, if you don't appoint a proxy, what's going to happen in that interesting family dynamic when you have an acute crisis? So by not taking care of this now, what are you doing? You're setting up your family for a very uncomfortable conversation. So clarify it from the get-go. Part number 2, after you do the proxy, by the way, and it's so funny when people tell me, I had this one person tell me, I got 4 kids, 3 are from, 1 isn't. So I said, which one did you appoint as the proxy? Answer? The not from one. So why the not from one? He says, because he'll do whatever I want. And the from one's going to start talking to the rabbi this or that. So this is interesting. So I said to them, well, why would you go to your rabbi? There's a from person I was talking to. So they said to me, I'm afraid that the rabbi is going to cause me or my family member to suffer. Well, I care about halacha. I don't want that to happen. And I said to him, that's terrible. Why do you think that about rabbis? And he said to me, because I know X, Y, and Z stories. So I said to him, b'vakasha. That's why I have an organization that's very transparent of our values, working with mainstream poskim who care very much about the sanctity of life and standing up for the sanctity of life, but also understand that quality of life and pain and suffering are values as well. You don't have to choose between, am I keep halacha or am I going to care about me suffering? It's a horrible thing. It's a horrible thing that people have this misimpression, which I understand this comes from somewhere. So that's part 1. The declaration. What are you saying in the declaration here? And this says in about 30 different ways, I only want my proxy to make these decisions. Why? Because in many circumstances, you can imagine a case where someone will try to remove the decision-making from the family and saying the family isn't doing what's in the best interest of the person could have anticipated this. And so our document tries to buttress on a legal level the standing of the proxy. This is why it matters which country you're in, because that's why we're concerned about formulating differently in Canada or in America or in UK. We're working on this and whatnot. It also declares that I give authority, my desire, which I hereby direct my proxy, that all decision-making about healthcare should be done in accordance with the Jewish law and custom. Now, what does Jewish law and custom mean? Answer?
According to your rabbi.
No. According to your rabbi, wait a minute. Who's the rabbi?
I don't know, well, your proxy is you're asking your proxy to consult with your rabbi.
Who's your rabbi?
Guy on the form.
What do you say?
The guy on the form.
The guy on the form, meaning you decide. One of the biggest shilas that we all have to ask ourselves is who do we decide is our rabbi? Who do we decide is our posek? This is a decision you have to make in life. If you want to have, right? So don't leave it up to general Orthodox Jewish law. Decide who is your posek. Not an easy question for everyone to answer, and I'll tell you why. Let's say you've had your shul rabbis involved, or you've had a rabbi from childhood, you have 5 different kids, one's yeshivish, one's Haredi, one's Dati Leumi, one's Modernisha, one's not from. Who are they asking?
The not from one.
No. Who are they asking? The answer is they're all asking their own rabbis. Is that what you wanted? Maybe. Or decide. Make a decision. Who's going to be the rabbi that makes those decisions? It's a very, very important decision for people to make in life. I mean, it's one of the rabbi, if you were here earlier, so Rabbi Glau was talking about, Selach harav, b'vakasha. This is the opportunity now to clarify for you and your family, who do you want to make decisions in these cases? It's not such an easy answer for some people, by the way. Some people are very close to certain rabbis, but they could also be close to a certain rabbi who they love for various reasons, but really have different feelings about, let's say, end-of-life care. Right? You could be, very close to a certain rabbi who you think is a wonderful darshan, wonderful about this, that, but you really have different issues on this thing. Are you going to choose him or not? That is one of the decisions you have to make in life. And we formulated it very carefully. As to the requirements of Jewish law and custom, I advise my proxy to consult with the following rabbi or religious institution. Why do we formulate it that way? Because we wanted to make it very clear on a legal level. Who's the proxy? The answer is the person you chose on page number 1. Now, if you want, you can choose your rabbi to be your proxy. Most rabbis I don't know don't want to be chosen as the proxy for a very simple reason. Unless they're your family member, they're not dropping everything on a regular basis to come down to the hospital. They can't do it. And so the rabbis don't typically, unless there are certain specific circumstances, want to be that. Now, remember we saw earlier that part of the reason why the RCA document fell was because of this, of organ donation. Now, I care a lot about the issue of organ donation. I think it's very important. It doesn't come up every day, but it's an important issue. I care a lot about it. I think it's an important issue. But I don't want to lose everyone on this issue, which is a Maaseh B'chol Yom, that everyone has to deal with, over the issue of organ donation. And so Rabbi Weiner, when he created the document for Cedar Sinai Hospital in LA, came up with the following formulation. This section is relevant only if death as defined by Jewish law and custom has been determined by my agent in consultation with my named rabbinic consultant. I authorize my proxy to approve transplantation of any organs and tissues permissible under Jewish law and custom. Have you declared now that you're going to donate organs? Yes, but only if death has been determined by my agent in consultation with my named rabbinic consultant. Meaning it's a way for people to sign up and say, if we get to the point where there is death, according to the posek I've chosen, I want my organs to be donated. Now, I did this for a second reason. Not only to get rid of this problem of the whole debate, but for a second issue. Technology is changing. If you were here earlier, you heard me speak about this as well. It could be 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now. There's going to be a lot more opportunities for organ donation even after cardiac death or circulatory death. In which case, why do I want people to sign up for a very specific type of death when other opportunities could exist? You can sign this document when you're 25. At the age of 50, 25 years from now, right, many opportunities could exist. And so we try to do it that way in order to get around some of these issues, anticipate the future. V'zeu. That's it. You sign it. 2 witnesses in 4 states in the United States. You have to have it notarized. And that is it, my friends. Simple document, legally binding. And we've set up with an organization, a company, you can have it digitally stored. So it can be accessed 24/7, 365 from anywhere in the world. Why is this important? Because this document ain't helping you if it's in your safe deposit. Yeah, don't put it in safe deposit. Or don't put it in your, with your last will and testament. Your last will and testament they're looking at after you're dead. This is a document you want to be with you. Now, the problem with this model alone, which is very good, I think everyone over the age of 18 should have it. Over the age of 18. Have this document, something set up, it protects them, helps to clarify a number of questions, but you haven't said anything to your loved ones about what your vision or personal preferences might be. Now, no one likes talking about our personal preferences about aging and end of life. Why? Because it makes us confront mortality, and no one likes to confront mortality. This isn't a Jewish thing, this is a general phenomenon and whatnot. However, if you don't speak about this at all, then how are they going to know when the moment of truth comes? So you're basically just kicking the decision down the butt, right? Kicking the bucket down the road. I've lived in Israel too long where all my English idioms are getting a little bit confused. But buckets, road, something like that, right? So you're pushing the decision to later and just leaving this for your family. But it's hard for people to have these conversations. And the conversations, by the way, aren't just about end-of-life decision-making. They're also about questions that can come up as people age and become more dependent on the help of their loved ones. And so we created a conversation guide. And this guide, which is a little bit of a different color scheme to separate it out, is not a legal document. It's not a legal document. It doesn't have to be signed, doesn't have to be sealed, doesn't have to be witnessed, but instead is a conversation guide that is meant to trigger conversations. How do you feel about pain, risk tolerance? Are there experiences you've had with death that you thought were good, that weren't good, right? And there are a couple of halachically sensitive questions about if I'm deemed terminally ill, what types of treatments might I want, but this is not a directive. Why don't we make this a directive? Because people's minds change. And you don't know where your healthcare journey is going to take. So if that's the case, what's the point of the conversation? The answer is every conversation, especially the first one, makes the next one a lot easier to have. I'll give you an analogy. It's a crude analogy, but pardon it, but makes the point. We all know that we should talk to our kids about the birds and the bees. When should we talk to our kids about the birds and the bees? When we can sit them down and talk to them about it properly in a mature way, or when we find them doing X, Y, and Z, wherever it might be. Answer is, makes a lot more sense to talk to them about it ahead of time properly, because the next conversation can be a lot more mature, informed, in a much more calmer manner. So the same thing is true when thinking about these issues. Trigger conversations, talk about some basic things. You don't have to write any answers here. There are boxes, there are scales. This is not a legally binding thing, it's not a directive. Now, there are other such documents that exist in the world today. They're not halachically sensitive. Meaning some of the options they give would be choices that wouldn't be appropriate, certainly as a default in halachic circumstances. And so we spend a lot of time working with rabbis and doctors and social workers and lawyers to formulate this in a way which will be a conversation guide. Now, this document, I don't think you have to sign when you're 18. Okay? But when you get to 50, maybe it's the first time, talk to you about your parents, talk about your loved one, whoever it might be. And every several years, right, you can, as your healthcare journey goes along, it becomes a lot easier to talk about these issues when you've talked about them beforehand. Baruch Hashem, the document now has the approval of Rabbi Willig and Rabbi Schechter. Have been very supportive of it in general. We're pushing with different organizations to get it out. And what I hope we're going to be able to accomplish here is to avoid some of the pitfalls of the many wonderful initiatives that have been taken by other organizations. I mean, Baruch Hashem, other organizations have set the tone, have made it stress the importance of it. And what we're trying now to do is to create something which we think works legally, right? Clarifies the critical questions that people have to decide. Who's going to make those decisions? Who's the rabbi you want that decision maker to talk to? That's a big decision. And to let the hospital and the healthcare providers know, Big Ado in general, this is how I see my healthcare should be guided by Jewish law and custom, which can be open to interpretation because there are differences of opinions about what that means in different circumstances. But that's why we empower the proxy. And then the second part is to open some conversations, because no one likes talking about mortality, but it's always, always, always going to be beneficial if you've talked about it a little bit. I'm going to tell you a couple of very sad stories. I hear about these at shivas. I go to a lot of shivas. And I'm always listening to the stories because it's informative for what I do. So I was at Shiva. He was an unbelievable man, unbelievable life. He lived till 67. He was a child polio survivor. He was a child cancer survivor. A whole slew of things. They told me he had 40 operations in his lifetime. He survives to 67, raises a family, 4 kids, Latiferet, and then has cancer again. And they know already he's terminally ill. And there's some urgent event. They bring him to the hospital. They say, should we resuscitate him or not? 40 surgeries in his life. All the kids look at each other and said, I don't know. What would he have wanted? Who's making this decision? They turn to his spouse. I don't know. I didn't talk to him about it. Now, I'm not blaming anyone because he was such a positive person. That's what allowed him to live through 40 surgeries. But no one had thought about beforehand. In the end, they did CPR on him for a while, broke his ribs, and he died. That is not a way this person should have died. And I'm not trying to give this as a dramatic example, but try to raise the point that there's certain basic conversations which are so important to have. And if we have these conversations, right, we can be much more informed about it. Now, of course, you need to know halacha, you need to know some of the framework for these types of things. But this is doable today. And if we're willing to confront and talk about these things, we'll be in a much better place. So I hope and pray that this document will be useful for a lot of people. But honestly, it's not about my organization's document or anyone else, right? We should just get this going in our community as a whole. And if it's someone else's document that works, that's great. Right? There are many different models for this. In Israel, the law is that the document has to be reviewed every 5 years, right? There's the proxy, it's only 5 year, which has a lot of logic to it. The American lawyers don't like it. The American lawyers don't like it because they say that you want to keep this as a stable document and not keep on having to question documents one form or another. Because then you put into the old documents into question. You could argue back and forth on this. So we advise people that every 5 years, you should make sure that this is up to date for what you want, without throwing it into question. That's sort of like a little bit of the compromise in terms of our legal advisors. So I hope that this will be a helpful thing. It's not gone out yet on the web, and I would very much welcome feedback. So I know it's not necessarily the most pleasant Shabbos reading, but nonetheless, right, if you want to take a look and give some feedback along the way, we'd certainly be happy. Go ahead.
Two quick things. One is,
Oh.
what if your rabbi is 90 years old?
So people ask me this all the time. They say to me, I'm not going to name names, but they ask me, my rabbi is 90 years old, should I put him down? Well, it depends how old you are. Right? So if you're 96, okay. But if your rabbi is 90, I wouldn't name him unless you're willing to keep on updating this document, which is fine. I get this question all the time because there's certain poskim that people have in mind. And I also say to them, by the way, he's a great posek. I try to talk to him as much as I can, but just know he's busy 18 hours of the day, giving shirim and this or that. So you might want to have someone who's more accessible, right, and whatnot. But that's part of the question.
Does the rabbi have to live in the...
No.
I'm in Canada.
No.
And the rabbi be in Israel.
Rabbi can be in Israel, Rabbi can be in Australia, because again, it's not a legal designation. You're telling the legal proxy, this is the person I'd prefer you to talk to. If you can reach that person in other countries, gesund ahead.
So my last question is a naive question. That is, what if I've never thought of this before? I have no idea what I'm going to start thinking about. Where do you start?
So you start with a form that tries to teach you how to do this.
So I want to go back on the Toronto thing because it's not what I was thinking about.
Oh.
I wanted to make that clear to people in case they have. It goes back about 9 or 10 years ago, before COVID.
Yeah.
The Rabbi did put out something in Toronto and published it and disseminated through all the different shuls. Many people in this room and beyond have received that, and that was the document that it was. And the difference between that and the RCA document was that it was going back in time to really the cookie cutter of menu type of style.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of the people, so what you're showing now, I believe is brand new. This Chaim Aruchim from Toronto, which I'd like to know more about in terms of that. But that's just a comment. The question is, in the Ematai, if you could distill it down to a few words, what is the real advantage of this over the newer RCA? In other words, the revised RCA.
I think for one thing is that there's a clear legal designation that's much clearer about who the proxy is, which I think is an important legal level. I think today the most important thing on a legal level is to buttress the status of the decision maker. Because what you want to protect yourself on is that you're protecting the proxy and saying, I think this proxy has my best interest in mind, knows what my wishes would be, and I'm declaring this and making this a statement. So if it comes to a court or comes to some disagreement, they're much more protected. I don't think the other documents are as good in terms of that. That's on the legal level. The second point, which I think is important, is we do give an option for organ donation because it doesn't happen every day, but when it happens, lives can be saved. I think that's important. We should have that on the table. I mean, there's just a case in New York of a brain dead patient at the age of 92 who donated liver. So, it used to be, organ donations for young people. Now, I thought it was still like 70. They had a 92-year-old. It comes up. It can come up, right? And so I think it's important to put that on the table and to keep that conversation going on it. And the third part is the conversation guide. It's important to have conversations about this to be at least about general sense of values and preferences, even if you're not going to make advanced decisions.
Why did you say that this is not yet applicable to Ontario?
Because the page here is a reference to some American laws about disclosure, HIPAA, and given the case law, you see, everyone's trying to anticipate what the law, what would happen if it goes to a court. So the Americans have a certain formulation that they think works, even though there's a lot of states in America, and that's what we're going with. And the Canadian attorneys that I'm working with are still trying to figure out what formulation they think is best. A lot has to do with the law in terms of, are we going to go with substitute judgment, best interest, when and how that will happen. And so that's what we're trying to
And when that happens, that'll be on your website?
Yeah, for sure. We sent that everywhere. But the conversation guide is good now.
Great.
If you live in two different countries like Israel and Canada, which we do,
Yeah.
do you have to have one there and one here?
I would. I'll tell you why. I mean, it's a little bit tricky, but you can be in a situation where you have a healthcare emergency somewhere else and you didn't have it. Now, it depends a little bit on what you're looking for. Like my grandmother, Zichronah Livracha, it was terrible. She had a DNR set up. She was living in Manhattan and Lower East Side, and she came to visit my aunt in Toronto, and that's where she died. And when the ambulance showed up, they were resuscitating her. And my father, who was a distinguished bioethicist, is on the phone from Texas, screaming at the paramedics, can't do it. My cousin, who's a doctor in New York, is trying to figure out this or that, but the paramedics were doing what the law required.
You know, you have to interview, you know what your wife thinks about you or your spouse or
Right.
whatever you put down, and you know what your rabbi or you know what his decision making is and how he talks about certain things, but what is his training in this area? And you have to interview your.
I don't know if you have to interview your rabbi, but I think it's helpful to have a conversation with your rabbi and say, listen, we're trying to come up with, create this. We want to know, do you feel comfortable, for example, being named as our, not every rabbi wants it. And some rabbis will say to you, listen, I'm your first call, but I'm going to send this up, which is fine. That's totally fine. Then you want to ask them, who are you sending it up to? Who's your posek on healthcare questions? That's a very important question. And depending on their answer, right, you might say, oh, that sounds great. It makes a lot of sense. That's respectful, this or that. It could be you know, right, that this is a person who has different views that you feel strongly different than. And so I would tell your rabbi, listen, my general feeling on this is where I'd want to be, within the realm of halacha. And your rabbi, who I think will be honest with you, will say either I can work with that, or call a different rabbi.
Rabbi shopping.
No, I don't. It's not rabbi shopping. In general, what does that mean, rabbi shopping? You're not searching for a terem. You're making a decision about who's your posek going to be in these questions. I mean, so there are plenty of people. They ask their Hilchot Shabbos questions to one rabbi, and Kashrus questions maybe the same person. When it comes to Hilchot Nida, though, they talk to someone else for a number of different reasons. That's perfectly reasonable. But you should figure out who that's going to be, and let your family members know who that's going to be, which is not going to be easy for all your family members. I don't mean you, right? Because you could have kids or this or that who have different rabbis who have different positions on this. B'vakasha, you should decide, unless you want your kids to decide for you, that's not bad, but let them know. Let them know what it is. Yeah, last question.
Do you have to discuss with the person you decide to have as your posek? I mean, we go to these lectures, okay?
Yeah.
We go to these shiurim, and maybe I say, I want Rabbi so-and-so to be my posek about these issues.
Yeah.
But he doesn't really know me, but I've read and studied a lot of the things that
Yeah.
he said, and maybe I feel like that's the person that's in line with what my thinking is. So do you have to like sit down and have this talk with a rabbi?
I would, because think about it. Let's say you put him down, put his phone number down, and he gets his phone call, and he says, Rachel's in the hospital and wants to know anything. Who's Rachel? And also, many poskim, particularly if in a certain realm of psak, right? Not everyone, but many poskim are going to care, at least to some level, of what your general values and preferences are. So if you sit down with them and you call them up and say, listen, or even send them this document, the guide, and say, listen, would this help you get a feel for who I am, and talk to them. So again, they're not going to be able to tell you, I'm going to tell you X, Y, and Z in a given scenario. But at least they'll know something about it. But I always, in general, I encourage people, Matai has a hotline. Right? You can put us down as your backup, or if you don't have a rabbi, he's in primary, right? You can call us and we'll help you. But I always recommend to people, it's best to do it with a rabbi who you know, they know you, and you trust them. Because these issues aren't just technical halachic questions. Is it chicken kosher or not kosher? There's a lot going on about it, and I would want a rabbi for some pastoral help for you, for your family, and whatnot. So it's always better, right, to have someone that knows you and that you know them. But, I see this now all the time, particularly after COVID. People stop going to this show, that show, whatever it might be. Someone called me up the other day, I'll end with this. He asked me about the document, whatever. So I said to him, you're a frum guy. He's 80. You're a frum guy. You've been going to show since 80 years. You're a rabbi. So he said to me, I was very close with this rabbi. This rabbi died last year. But now I'm 80, and I got to figure out what to do. So what about your kids? So I know his kids. So one of his kids is a chashuva guy who goes to shul, and his rabbi just retired, moved to Israel, and has health issues. So now they need to figure out. But I'm happy they're trying to figure out who that call is going to be made to. Okay? Thank you.